I mean, that's very well said. And of course, Mackinder is explicit about it, that, Germany is an issue. Russia is an issue. But when we today think about the heartland theory, there's so much focus on Russia that we forget that Germany is, one of the key players in this whole, I guess, on this whole geostrategic game board. And that this fact, which you underscore here, goes a long way to explaining how and why perhaps the whole Ukraine project seems to be aimed just as much at destroying Germany utterly as it does seem to be aimed at creating problems for Russia as well.
I mean, it's basically taking the old nationalism argument and turning it on its head and seeing that, of course, as we see with Ukraine, and as we saw with the Tsar wanting, say, for example, to take over Czechoslovakia and become Tsar of Bohemia, etc., the same example has been used again and again, whether it be the Germans against the Slavs or the vice versa, or even better, from the point of view of the degradation of the heartland, causing inter-Slavic strife within the whole makeup of Pan-Slavism, which is why, again, Putin has to desperately appeal to a fading notion of historical continuity. You can look at this and say, that's very, very cynical. But you have to sort of look at how committed someone like Mackinder is. So, for example, he laments over and over and over again how Britain didn't get involved in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Of course, most people look to that and say, thank goodness we didn't get involved in that conflict. But the fact that someone like Mackinder is basically advocating the wisdom in hindsight of basically something that would have been impossible and near suicidal at the time and would have left us in a terrible position and would have been completely ruinous to France more so than happened historically. I think it's interesting the extent to which he'll go in order to counter what he believes to be Prussian despotism. Just something to consider. Morgoth, any thoughts?
I think it's interesting that when we look at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, to point out, like, Mackinder would have thought that the Prussians were more barbaric, they were more of the land, and the Germans on the west would have been more liberal. But then I think it may have been him, or was it all of the Germans? But I just think it's interesting that the Iron Curtain ran straight through the middle of it and kind of disconnected it. So we got the liberals, and then the sort of the problematic Prussians were kept in the east.
Well, I mean, the Bavarians are very parochial and socially conservative and Catholic. When you look at Germany and you look at you can say the centers of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, you look to places like the Nord Rhine, the Ruhr, Bremen, Hamburg, areas which are formerly republics within the Holy Roman Empire and then the Kaiserreich. So yes, there is that element, but of course you have to remember that places like Berlin and various industrial areas in the east were also quite left wing. But I mean that's basically another question of the liberal makeup of West Germany versus East Germany. But again, another interesting point to consider: why is it that a German alliance with the Soviet Union or a German alliance, the Kaiserreich, allying with the Tsar, is such a horrific prospect that a world war must be contrived to prevent that happening? And yet at the same time, many policymakers in the 1940s, before you can say really the emergence of containment, were prepared to basically allow for the Soviet Union to occupy half of Europe.
Yes, we haven't even touched on the fact that at its greatest extent, what would be considered the Rimland was essentially West Germany. And it's further, and that was as a yeah.
I think, again, that the point I made, I mean, when I was talking about the Russo-Japanese War, and I was talking about the victories of Stalin and the consolidation of Stalinism, Marxism-Leninism, and the Soviet Union. And of course, we're also talking about the idea of the communists in China as well, and the fact that they were allied to one another before the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. What is interesting, though, about that situation is that regardless of how vast the quote-unquote control of the heartland emanating out of these regions, the very basis of the rimland was still controlled by the powers basically following the Mackinder view of things, i.e., India did not become communist, contrary to some expectations. Pakistan was a Western ally. Iran, for most of its history, was a Western ally. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Turkey were Western allies. Of course, Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway. If the Soviet Union had control, say, for example, over Denmark and Norway, it could have had effective access into the Atlantic. Instead, it had to settle with the Arctic seaport Murmansk. In the East, of course, when you had the Sino-Soviet split, all of the potential aspirations you had of expanding, towards South Korea, as we saw the Korean War, towards Japan, towards Taiwan, were again thwarted. And of course, you mentioned the example with Vietnam. So regardless of how great, ostensibly, the victory of Stalin would appear, they were ultimately still hemmed in within this rimland because they were unable, the Soviets, to project effective power out towards the sea in a way that would have been, I would say, strategically decisive. So this can go back to thinking which is much, much earlier than Mackinder, going all the way back to Lord Palmerston and getting involved in Greece, getting involved in the Turkish Empire, all to prop up states that would deny Russia and the quote-unquote heartland power access to all of these crucial maritime spheres. And of course, if we see the main gaping hole in that is not actually East Germany or Eastern Europe, it's actually China. That, of course, ironically, was not solved by the West, but as a result, you can say, of the own personal ambitions and the own brand of communism espoused by Mao Zedong.
I mean, what I'm interested in as well, because I get called both a kind of Western sort of warmonger, NATO shill, and a Russian shill. On a given day, I get called both of those. And what I think is interesting is that there's assumption in the general discourse that mainly because of certain big sort of podcasts on YouTube, which are sort of adjacent to our circles, that the Russia, then the heartland, has actually no interest in breaking out. It has no interest in moving further in any direction. All it wants is kind of happy trade negotiations and helping countries with their economies and being friendly to everybody. And is it fair to say that as Putin Russia, as it's constituted now, actually does want or is happy to just sit there and not actually expand further out? Because it really matters when we sort of look at some, say, the Duran. And I did an article a while ago about this, which a lot of people kind of seem to be shocked by, because I was essentially saying the European Union actually should rearm itself. I find it weird and ridiculous that, like, it has become sort of received wisdom that the European Union would just have no weapons, that it would be essentially demilitarized entirely. And this, at the same time, that the Americans were moaning that they weren't paying enough for NATO and all of the rest of it. And it seems to be that this idea that we are always the aggressor, we are always the one that's provoking the problem. And in the case, there's a lot of attention paid to Britain here. But in the modern context, in the context in the 2020s, it really is bureaucrats in the European Union who are banging the drums just as loud as anybody in London, which I find bizarre, to be quite honest. Again, they aren't sort of inherent sea powers. Belgium or Austria or these, they're not actual sea powers. The European Union is sort of on a big peninsula. I can at least understand that it's the received wisdom in the British Isles, in London. But even then, we have to kind of think, well, we just remain utterly defenseless, because at the end of the day, the heartland just wants peace and love. And I just think, is this historically normal to think this way, or is it that I was listening to a podcast, like a YouTube video essay on this the other day, and he was pointing out actually that sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But the point of it was that the aggression is all one way, and that there's no incentive and no interest in Russia actually expanding in any place. And I just think that's a big risk. What if you're wrong?
What if I'm wrong?
No, like the sort of the general consensus that we don't need to be armed because Russia has no interest whatsoever in breaking.
Yes, I think unfortunately you need to be cynical of anyone who peddles that particular line. But just before I get to your question, yes, read some history, and yes, but the Baltic Sea is like the Black Sea. It's hemmed in by other powers that control the gateway, in this case, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, which Russia was never able to finally defeat. And of course, as you know, Peter the Great was basically an advocate of Alfred Teja Mahan's ideas 200 years before they became sort of endemically in vogue. Regarding your point about what the European Union is doing, whatever the European Union is doing is playing right into the hands of the Mackinder theorists, basically, which is the idea that Europe must be kept permanently separated from the heartland, lest it pose a threat to Britain or America, or the quote-unquote democratic powers, as someone like Mackinder would refer to them as. You take someone like Angela Merkel, and the overriding concern that she was becoming too dependent on Nord Stream, on Russian gas pipes. And on the other hand, we now know that she was pursuing a double game of essentially allowing for economic cooperation, but also helping along the Maidan movement and the separation of Ukraine from Russia as well. But now you come to the modern position of someone like a Friedrich Merz, who has none of the capabilities of such nuance, or dare I say, elements of duplicity in that argument, that just seems to be passionately against Russia for no reason. So that's one extreme. And the other extreme, of course, is saying that, we have nothing to fear from Russia. In fact, I'm afraid to say that I've heard the argument that Russia has never been a threat to Europe, which I can just discount as being historically preposterous. You just need to look at the ambitions of Alexander I. You need to look at the whole basis of the communist project. Yes, you may try and separate Russia as a nation as distinct from the Soviet project, but the Soviet project was quite clear in terms of what it wanted to achieve, whether aggressively or by other means, i.e., asymmetrical warfare. Or what have you. And I've already mentioned my rather revisionist take of the bellicose nature of Tsar Nicholas II, how he basically precipitated two major wars, both of which Russia lost catastrophically. But in both instances, I believe they were fundamentally aggressive. So yes, on the one hand, it makes sense effectively for, you can say, Europe to not assume a position of benevolence from the heartland, which is incredibly naive. Yet we've also assumed the opposite position, which is that modern day Russia is basically National Socialist Germany again. And something that I find fascinating about Putin, and actually compared to, say, for example, the arguments of pan-Slavism that you bring up, that have been brought up by a lot of other people, is the idea that now Putin seems to be belatedly pursuing a